Welcome everyone. Before we begin, please note that simultaneous interpretation is available for this webinar in Spanish and English. To access this, please click Interpretation in the meeting controls and select the language you'd like to listen to. Interpretation in the meeting controls and select the language you'd like to listen to. Okay, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Tom Dixon, Communication Lead for Forest Peoples Programme. And today I have the very privileged role of moderating this press briefing on behalf of the local Biodiversity Outlooks team. This team includes the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network, the Centres of Distinction on Indigenous and Local Knowledge, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and Forest Peoples Programme. Today, we're joined by a panel of experts in their respective fields. We'll hear from several community representatives and activists based around the world, and also a representative from UN Biodiversity. Before we move on, I'd just like to briefly explain the format of this event and how you can ask questions. Our panelists will all be giving remarks for the first 40 minutes, and then we'll be taking questions from the floor for the remainder of our time together. To ask the questions, those of you who are using the Zoom platform can use the Q&A function on your screens. And for those of you joining via the live webcast, you can submit your questions on the YouTube discussion group. If you're unable to submit questions either of those ways, you can also email us at biodiversity@forestpeoples.org. I'll repeat that again later on, and will also be on the slides. I'll introduce the speakers as we go along. And the outline running order, we will have a welcome from John Scott, representing the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. We'll have welcome remarks from Joji Carino, who is the co-lead author of the local Biodiversity Outlooks too. And following that, we will hear from our panelists who represent Indigenous and local community organisations from around the world. So, to begin with, I'd like to welcome John Scott, representing the Secretariat on the Convention of Biological Diversity. John is an Indigenous descendant from northeastern Australia, with a significant background in education, social policy, law, Indigenous rights and traditional knowledge. His professional life has included as a teacher, as an Aboriginal Education Advisor, a Senior Policy Officer for Aboriginal Social Justice Commission, Indigenous Human Rights Officer with the UN High Commission on Human Rights, and Social Affairs Officer at the Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Currently, John is Chief of the Peoples and Biodiversity Unit at the Convention on Biological Diversity, with responsibilities covering Indigenous peoples, local communities, gender, health and human rights. John, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tom, for your kind words this morning. Welcome, big welcome from me to all of our friends and supporters out there. I am outside of Montreal, so welcome from Mohawk territory, and I want to acknowledge the traditional peoples of the land that I'm on at the moment, the Mohawk people. So last week, with 4 other organisations, the Forest Peoples Programme published the 2nd edition of the local Biodiversity Outlooks. It's a landmark piece of collaborative research and analysis that presents the perspectives and experiences of Indigenous peoples and local communities on the current socio-ecological crisis and their contribution to the strategic plan for biodiversity for the Convention on the Convention. Provides the perspectives of those who live close to nature. It comes at a time when we are seized by a terrible global pandemic, and it is becoming increasingly obvious that humanity's relationship with nature has broken down. 1 minute. In a week's time, the United Nations General Assembly will host a summit on biodiversity. The recent research, including the latest Living Planet report from WWF and the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook launched last week, have demonstrated that action to prevent the further loss of biodiversity is urgently needed. And for this decade, bringing us up to 2020, we again have failed to meet most of the 20 targets set. The local biodiversity outlooks reports make it clear, however, that in approaching the biodiversity crisis, the 6th extinction crisis, and in developing the goals that will replace the Arche biodiversity targets, we must recognise the vital contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities to both biological and cultural diversity. LBO2 will be a useful negotiation tool in the ongoing development and negotiation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which will take us through to 2050 in order to achieve humanity's vision of living in harmony with nature. The Global Biodiversity Framework, of course, has been delayed, and now we are expecting the next subsidiary body meetings in the first quarter of next year, and that sometime next year, perhaps in May or later, that the governing body will come together to adopt the Global Biodiversity Framework. So as we continue to journey towards the development of an ambitious and wide-ranging new Global Biodiversity Framework, this framework urgently needs to set out ambitious and wide range of living in harmony with nature. It must be both practical and transformational. A great transformation could be achieved by fully unleashing the power of the collective and local actions of Indigenous peoples and local communities for our vision of living in harmony with nature. These local actions are optimistic testimonies that the destruction of nature can be successfully reversed. I call on governments and parties to the convention, the international community, to ensure that the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And I challenge you to unleash the power of the collective and local actions of Indigenous peoples and local communities in order to assist humanity to achieve our vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. And I'll stop there this morning and look forward to hearing from our speakers that are coming up. Thank you.
Many thanks, John, for those words on how critical the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities are to our global action that we all need to take. And thank you for all of your support from your team and from the convention. I would like to now introduce Joji Carino to share some highlights from the report that John was talking about there. Joji is Ibaloi Igorot from the Cordillera in the Philippines. Joji is the Senior Policy Advisor at Forest Peoples Programme and a lead writer together with Maurizio Ferrari of the Local Biodiversity Outlooks too. Joji's been an active campaigner and advocate for the past 35 years on Indigenous peoples' human rights at community, national and international levels. She's a recognised leader in Indigenous processes covering biodiversity, Indigenous knowledge and sustainable development. Joji strongly supports community-based research and monitoring, also coordinating a network of centres of distinction on Indigenous and local knowledge. Joji, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm going to share a PowerPoint. Okay, are the slides okay?
We can't see your slides, Joji, at the moment.
Not yet. Sorry about this.
The delights of doing everything via Zoom.
Can you see them now?
Perfect. Thank you, Joji.
Okay, thanks. Thank you to members of the press and to everyone joining us today. Local Biodiversity Outlooks is a complementary publication to Global Biodiversity Outlook. Both publications were launched last week at a scientific meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity. What is distinctive about LBO? In many reports about biological diversity, the local and cultural perspectives as lived by indigenous peoples and local communities are often missing. Voices challenging mainstream views are also often marginalized in popular media. This report seeks to address that gap by making visible the contributions of indigenous peoples and local communities. GBO has headlined alarming failures in our political, economic, technological, and cultural systems, which have extracted far too much from nature, leaving the Earth's biosphere damaged and weak. LBO highlights other facets of the biodiversity story. This focus on local biodiversity and stories of resilience, from speakers giving voice to the pains of Mother Nature as her children and healers. Indigenous peoples and local communities who are actively working with biological diversity, genes, species, and ecosystems alongside its cultural meaning as food and medicine, as relations, and as homelands. With the world awakening to the crisis of the Anthropocene and how human systems are breaching the limits of natural systems, what futures emerge from the perspectives of the peoples living within these ecosystems? Those have experienced the earliest and latest impacts of colonialism and structural dominion over nature and people. LBO2 highlights over 50 stories by indigenous and local community authors from around the world, sharing their solutions on the current social and ecological crisis. Each story speaks to a vision and a commitment for building better futures driven by solidarity and collective actions. Examples include actions on species decline and recovery, halting the expansion of the industrial agricultural frontier, benefit sharing from the use of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. What is covered by LBO2? Similar to GBO5, an assessment is made of progress made under each target of the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. A chapter on interlinkages across biodiversity, climate, and sustainable development highlights how local collective actions can deliver conservation, climate mitigation, and local livelihoods, leaving no one behind. Through these seasoned voices, Local Biodiversity Outlooks proposes 6 transitions necessary for the survival of people and planet. These are on land, food, culture, governance, economies, and incentives and finance. I will expand on this later. So what are the findings and lessons contained in LBO2. Similar to the Aichi biodiversity targets, similar to other Aichi targets, Target 18, addressing traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, has not been met. Only 10% of parties have reported, including indigenous and local communities, in their national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Ongoing disregard of culture-based solutions as integral to biodiversity conservation, restoration, and sustainable use has been a major missed opportunity in the past decade. This neglect has affected the underachievement of all the 20 Aichi targets. Putting the cultures and rights of indigenous peoples and local communities at the heart of the 2050 biodiversity strategy would deliver sustainable livelihoods and well-being and positive outcomes for biodiversity and climate. This is strongly supported by evidence that indigenous peoples have been the best stewards of biological diversity within ancestral territories. Their legacy and tested foundation for improved conservation outcomes into the future. LBO's second message is that nature and culture work together. Overcoming separation and imbalances in the relationships between humans and nature is central to addressing the biodiversity and health crisis, including the rise of pandemics like COVID-19. Science needs indigenous and local knowledge to solve contemporary problems with holism and reciprocity. Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing evoke new narratives and visions of culture and nature working together within a living and sacred earth. Local Biodiversity Outlooks proposes 6 critical transitions in the coming decade. Land. Securing land rights and customary land tenure of indigenous peoples and local communities will also secure biodiversity. Food. Revitalizing indigenous and local sustainable food systems will shift us away from industrial agriculture towards agroecology and food sovereignty. Culture. Valuing diverse ways of knowing and doing are fundamental to transformative change. Governance. Inclusive decision-making and self-determined development to end discrimination and exclusion in political life. Economies. Sustainable use of resources and the flourishing of diverse local economies away from extractive capitalism and gross social inequalities. Incentives and finance. Rewarding effective indigenous solutions and stop financing destruction. These are intergenerational visions, honoring the historical struggles and wisdom of past generations, drawing from the experience and innovations of today's living generations, and embodying the legacy and hopes for future generations. They contribute to humanity's joint endeavor to save our common home. Our authors and speakers present today will give substance to these compelling stories. Thank you very much for your attention, and big thanks to our collaborators and donors. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Joji, for taking us through this incredible piece of research, which will be vital in all future negotiations on protecting the world's biodiversity. And I think, as you so well put it, for the future of people and planet. We now like to turn to the first of our panelists, Miguel Guimaraes, who will elaborate on the important role played by communities on the front lines, standing up to deforestation and land degradation. Miguel is a Shipibo Conibo leader and currently president of the Federation of Native Communities of Ucayali, Fekanau. Founded in 1981, Fekanau is one of the oldest indigenous organizations in the Peruvian Amazon and currently has over 30 members from the Shipibo Conibo, Ashaninka, Iskwanawa, and Awujan indigenous peoples. Within Fekanau, Miguel works closely with communities to defend their rights and territories against threats such as land invasions, illegal logging, narcotics production, agribusiness expansion, oil and gas extraction, and harmful infrastructure mega projects. Miguel, you have the floor. While we wait for Miguel, and in case anybody joined slightly late, please choose the language channel that you would like to use at the bottom. Thank you. Miguel, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias. Muy buenos días a toda la audiencia y toda la prensa que está presente. Para mí es un honor tener este espacio y agradezco nuevamente a FPP por facilitarme y hacer escuchar la voz de nuestra lucha, ¿no? Entonces, FECONAU, Federación de Comunidades Nativas del Ucayali y Afluentes FECONAU, es una organización indígena que tiene más de 40 años defendiendo los derechos colectivos de los pueblos indígenas en defensa territorial. Nuestra preocupación es que a pesar de los esfuerzos que hacemos de seguir resistiendo, defendiendo nuestros bosques, nuestros territorios, nuestros recursos, que son nuestra única esperanza de seguir vivos en este mundo, están siendo amenazadas por varias actividades. Una consulta, ¿sigo hablando o espero la interpretación?
It's okay, Miguel. Yeah, interpreting is good.
Sí, sigo.
Sí, gracias.
Sí, ok. Entonces, nosotros enfrentamos, repito nuevamente, o en todo caso, nuestros territorios indígenas, que son nuestra única esperanza de vivir, están siendo amenazadas por las grandes actividades como agronegocios, ¿no? Expansión de monocultivos como palma aceitera. El otro tema fuerte que estamos enfrentando actualmente es el tema de narcotráfico. Solo para mencionar una comunidad que tiene 21,000 hectáreas de territorios titulados, está siendo invadido por narcotráfico para sembrar hoja de coca más de 2,000 hectáreas, ¿no? Entonces son problemas fuertes que venimos enfrentando y repetimos nuevamente, la pandemia ha servido para que estas actividades se sumen o se tripliquen, ¿no? De la forma de seguir trabajando en nuestros territorios, ¿no? Entonces, en vez de paralizar estas actividades, lo único que ha hecho la pandemia es aumentar, ¿no? Y poner en riesgo nuevamente la vida de nuestros hermanos indígenas que habitan en estos lugares, ¿no? Entonces, en este contexto, tanto de palma, aceitera, ¿no? Agronegocios y el tema de narcotráfico, tala ilegal, lo único que hacen es destruir nuestros bosques, contaminar nuestras aguas, que son nuestra fuente de vida, ¿no? El único lugar donde podemos meditar o relacionarse con nuestra naturaleza, ¿no? Entonces, son situaciones aún que desde el Estado peruano no está poniendo la agenda, la problemática que tienen los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Ahí nosotros hacemos un llamado a los mecanismos internacionales de seguir apoyándonos en esta lucha, en este proceso de seguir defendiendo nuestros derechos colectivos, ¿no? Entonces, para nosotros es sumamente preocupante esta situación, ¿no? Entonces, nosotros hemos vivido muchísimos años conservando, ¿no?, lo que la naturaleza nos ha dado, ¿no? También el sistema de producción que nosotros hemos utilizado siempre ha sido de manera responsable, respetando siempre la naturaleza, no utilizando insumos químicos, ¿no? Eso nos caracteriza que somos los mejores elementos que hemos utilizado la naturaleza de acuerdo a nuestras necesidades, ¿no? Nunca hemos destruido para sembrar algo ilícito en nuestros territorios, pero que en estos momentos, estos territorios que nosotros hemos conservado de generación en generación durante muchos años, está siendo amenazados por intereses individuales, ¿no? Yo creo que es sumamente importante articular esfuerzos para que nuestro esfuerzo o el esfuerzo que hacemos de seguir conservando la naturaleza siga siendo una agenda que nos permita también asegurar nuestras vidas, ¿no? Porque en este contexto, en esta coyuntura, los únicos perjudicados somos los que defendemos los derechos colectivos de los pueblos indígenas, los defensores de bosques, los defensores de tierras, ¿no? Aún lamento decir que las amenazas en estos momentos siguen siendo latentes, es fuerte, tanto las comunidades en donde se siembra el tema de hoja de coca o palma aceitera, el caso emblemático Santa Clara de Uchuña, aún sigue siendo, las comunidades se sienten inseguros, reciben amenazas. Entonces se vuelve una situación difícil, complicado. Nosotros siempre hemos dicho que ya no queremos más muertes a los defensores de derechos humanos, a los defensores de bosques, ¿no? Entonces, nuevamente hago un llamado en esta lucha que nosotros hemos emprendido hace mucho tiempo. Queremos que los aliados se sumen a este esfuerzo grande que nosotros hemos iniciado, ¿no? Entonces, repito nuevamente, estamos en una situación difícil, complicado, las comunidades están inseguros y nuestro esfuerzo de seguir apoyando a ellos sigue siendo limitado por las cuestiones más logísticos, distancia geográfica, pero repito nuevamente, nuestra lucha va a seguir siendo en defensa de los derechos colectivos, en defensa de nuestros bosques, ¿no? Entonces, yo repito nuevamente y agradezco este espacio. Espero que se haga réplica en todo el mundo la situación que estamos viviendo actualmente, ¿no? A eso se suma la pandemia que hemos enfrentado hace poco, que ha llevado a nuestros líderes, a nuestros ancestros, no solo han llevado personas físicamente, ¿no?, sino que han llevado todo un conocimiento que hemos aprendido de ellos de generación en generación, ¿no? Entonces, yo estoy sumamente preocupado porque en nuestros territorios donde nosotros caminamos libremente para hacer nuestras chacras, para nuestra vivencia, ya no se puede hacer, ¿no? Hay personas con armas de fuego cuidando nuestro territorio, ¿no? Entonces no podemos ingresar libremente a estos territorios ancestrales que fue nuestro y que sigue siendo nuestro, ¿no? Porque por personas que se han impuesto ahí para sembrar algo que en todo el mundo no está permitido, ¿no? Algo ilícito. Entonces, eso es mi preocupación, comparto mi preocupación desde la Amazonía peruana. Nosotros representamos a los pueblos indígenas de 3 pueblos, Ashánica, Shipibo, Conibo, Awajún, ¿no? Somos pueblos de lucha, seguiremos defendiendo lo que es nuestro porque es nuestra única esperanza de seguir viviendo en este mundo, pero que por ahora está siendo destruido, repito nuevamente, por intereses mezquinos, por intereses individuales que no ayudan en construir un desarrollo más responsable que permita que los pueblos sigan viviendo de manera sostenible, ¿no? Solo quería compartir esta experiencia real, vivo, ¿no? Y hay una necesidad de seguir haciendo incidencia y que nuestra voz llegue a nivel del mundo, porque también entiendo que hay personas en el mundo que también están sufriendo las mismas amenazas, las mismas necesidades, ¿no? Entonces, creo que, repito nuevamente, es seguir pidiendo el apoyo de los aliados y unir esfuerzos en esta lucha frontal que no lo vamos a terminar de un día para otro, ¿no? Es un proceso que nos permite también en esta coyuntura, en este momento, compartir con ustedes lo que está pasando en la Amazonía, ¿no? Que es algo que se ve no solo en Perú, sino en toda la Amazonía, Ecuador, Colombia, ¿no? Pero son experiencias que quizás desde otro espacio o desde otro ángulo, estén donde estén, ustedes nos puedan un poco apoyar a seguir resistiendo esta lucha que no es de ahora, que son luchas de generación en generación, donde también hemos perdido muchas personas que han defendido sus territorios, han defendido sus bosques, y este compromiso y esta tarea es lo que nosotros seguimos haciendo. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Miguel. Thank you. Thank you for that powerful story on how important it is for everyone in this world to join forces and to respect the rights of those who defend the world's forests day in, day out, and at significant risk, at the risk of their own safety and sometimes their lives. And we thank you for sharing those very personal stories, Miguel. We will now hear from another speaker about conservation and conserving biodiversity, Tonio Sadik. Tonio will discuss why the recognition of indigenous territories must be part of the pathway to meeting any target. Tonio is Director of Environment at Canada's Assembly of First Nations, working on a range of issues from climate change and species at risk to fisheries and food security. He is a board member with Climate Reality Canada and a principal investigator for the First Nations Food, Nutrition and Environment Study. Tonio has a PhD from Simon Fraser University and teaches in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ottawa. Tonio, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tom. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this important panel and the release of the local Biodiversity Outlooks second edition, which took place last year. Last week. We've had the opportunity to focus on the work of the CBD and specifically the HE targets here in Canada. And we have case studies of the LBO2, I think, in a very important and productive way. The important message that I want to communicate to you today relates to how things can be done different, Miguel's focus on the Peruvian context, of course, demonstrates many of the challenges that indigenous peoples face the world over. And without wanting to suggest that we've addressed everything in Canada to any extent, quite the contrary, we heed federal government's approach to implementing the HE targets. And in the LBO2, we focus on targets 11 and 12. And I want to just focus on target in Canada, and I'll just do that very briefly. What we've seen in Canada is the domestic adoption of the HE targets and relating to Target 11 in a national process that involves Indigenous peoples in a meaningful way and looks to conservation and protection through a rights recognition lens. That is, rather than sometimes referred to as fortress conservation, that is, identify an area of land for conservation and effectively bar it off from use by Indigenous peoples and others. In Canada, we have been able to mobilize the concept of preserved areas, IPCAs. This is unique to Canada. It reflects the unique circumstances of Indigenous peoples, First Nations in Canada, and involves a recognition of governance on the part of Indigenous peoples, and specifically First Nations, in the protection and conservation of land. What we have seen, and this has now been is demonstrated very thoroughly in the LBO2, but is also supported in the release of the IPBES. Peoples retain governance, authority, and access to their traditional lands, whether this is formally recognized or informally, that the biodiversity outcomes and conservation outcomes on those lands is much higher. And in fact, that the only hope that, or the only bright spot perhaps to say, in the context of conservation and protection relates to those lands that are managed and occupied by Indigenous peoples. An important part of this in Canada is also the growing willingness on the part of the government on the rights of Indigenous peoples, further supporting the need for a rights-based approach. So with this, I want to suggest that we can learn from the Canadian example as we make slow progress in Canada, in that if conservation targets need to be met globally, if we are looking to protect 30% of land by 2030 around the world, that rights recognition is an enabler of that. Rather than trying to exclude Indigenous peoples, rather than closing off the access to lands, the recognition that we are in a reciprocal relationship with nature is so fundamental and reflects the Indigenous teachings that are often spoken about both in Canada and in the broader global context. So I will stop there, Tom, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tonio. Some very important perspectives on the inclusion of Indigenous people in conserving protected areas and on the rights-based approach needed in Tonio's case in Canada, but I think across the world as well. I will now hand over to Debbie Gownsmith about the importance of Indigenous food systems and the revitalization of traditional food production methods. Debbie is a co-founder of Kua Ainu Ulu Auomo. Kua, and Debbie will pronounce that correctly for me in a second. Kua is a non-profit organization located in the US state of Hawaii. And Kua is a growing movement of Hawaiian people and local communities for nature, culture, and justice. Debbie holds a master's degree in economic development and is currently a PhD candidate with a dissertation focusing on culturally rooted evaluation of KUA's indigenous networks. Debbie, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. I feel very honored to be here, and I'm really privileged to be speaking on behalf of Kua Aina Ulu Awamo, or KUA, which we interpret to mean grassroots growing through shared responsibility. KUA, which is our acronym, means backbone in Hawaiian, and we serve as a backbone organization to multiple networks in Hawaii that are reclaiming stewardship of land and sea. These networks bring together fishers, farmers, and cultural practitioners who address resources management and food security holistically as relationship to people and to place. So the Hawaiian Islands are the most remote island chain in the entire world. And prior to colonization of Hawaii by the United States, local fishing, aquaculture, and agriculture fed a population that was almost the same size as the residential population of Hawaii today. But today we import almost 90% of our food, which is not only unsustainable, but it also puts us at risk of natural or political disaster that would keep food from coming to the islands. In addition to sufficient agricultural infrastructure and knowledge, there still exists in Hawaii the ancient aquaculture infrastructure of local i'a, or fish ponds, along with generational knowledge of how to manage those fish ponds. So prior to colonialism, there were almost 500 fish ponds in use across Hawaii, and Hawaiians developed specializations in fish pond technology that are globally unique. Today, local communities are restoring these fish ponds. These are brilliant structures at the coastline that are anywhere between an acre in size to 100 acres in size. The fish pond you see on your screen here is an 88-acre fish pond called He'eia Fish Pond. So fish ponds trap fish within a living ecosystem to feed families and, in fact, entire communities while improving coastal ecological health. More than 38 fish ponds and more than 100 fish pond owners, workers, and practitioners are active in the fish pond network that KUA facilitates, which is called Hui Malama Loko I'a, which roughly translates to the partnership that preserves and protects fish ponds. In 1901, a survey found 99 active fish ponds producing almost 750,000 pounds of fish. So the potential contribution of indigenous knowledge to food production is really promising. Hawaii's fish pond practitioners and restorers and workers today are indigenous experts playing a critical role in restoring local food security in the islands. Mahalo nui. Thank you very much for having us here today.
Thank you very much, Debbie. It's wonderful that you could take part. And thank you for those words about the importance of sustainable food systems, which are really critical to the future of nature and people. Our next speaker is Josefa Tauli. Josefa will discuss the importance of traditional knowledge for young people and the linkages between biological and cultural diversity. Josefa is an indigenous Ibulau Kankanaey Igonot youth from the Cordillera, Philippines, with a background in biocultural diversity conservation and grassroots initiatives for indigenous youth. She represents indigenous and local youth on the steering committee of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network and has been an active part of the youth delegation to the Convention on Biological Diversity meetings since 2018. Josefa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tom. Gawis ay agaw kung kayo amin. My name is Josefa Tauli and I'm an Ibalay Kankanaey Igorot, speaking to you from the mountains of the Cordillera in the Philippines. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. As a young indigenous person, I'm very happy to have been able to contribute to the LBO2, which is a very rich report with messages that are very relevant to all people and all cultures. It is a very solid evidence base coming directly from the voices on the ground, from the heart of biodiversity, which decision makers must listen to during these crucial times in global biodiversity policy. So those who spoke before me already demonstrated illustrated very well a diversity of very important issues that are captured in the LBO2. To add to their voices, today I will be talking about a topic that means a lot to young people, and that is education and the crucial role it plays in achieving the transformation we need. More and more, we are realizing that the current biodiversity crisis is that we are facing is at the root, caused by the prevailing philosophy that separates nature and culture. It is this thinking that spurs states to fence off more and more nature from people. It is what makes many believe that humans can exploit nature as we please without thought of the consequences for others. And it is also what is keeping us from coming up with holistic solutions that address biodiversity loss and cultural diversity loss together. Society as a whole is losing sight of humanity's deep interconnections with nature. And so to repair these broken connections across the whole of society in a way that will be felt for generations and generations to come, we think that transforming education will be key. So how can we do this? Indigenous ways of knowing already demonstrate the importance of sustaining values of care for and reciprocity with nature and each other. We also know that it is crucial to support the intergenerational transmission of indigenous and local knowledge and the sustainable ways of living that lead to conservation outcomes and that the whole of society can learn from. We can transform education by breaking nature and culture silos that exist in academia and creating dialogue between traditional knowledge and Western scientific knowledge. And we need to recognize and support indigenous education whilst also promoting learning by doing and experiencing nature all across the board. So these approaches will help repair relationships with nature where they have been lost. A transformative education that integrates the diverse values of biodiversity, but also cultural diversity, sustainability, languages, human rights, and heritage, which are all inextricably linked to biodiversity, is something that we have been actively advocating for as the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which represents youth in the CBD. This is something we have been advocating for to be included in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we're glad that the LBO2 provides evidence base to support this call. To end, we must remember that people and nature are one system. They cannot be separate. And this is what we hope to see reflected in all aspects of biodiversity policy and action going forward. Yeah, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josefa. And thank you for the critical youth perspective and also the critical values of indigenous and local knowledge, education, and sustainable ways of being. And I think at the end there, you really captured it, and that people and nature are one system. Now, we have faced, so far we've done okay with connections today, but we have faced a few connection issues with final speaker, and we're hoping he will be able to join us. So if all goes well, we will now hear from Peter Kitello about the violence inflicted on many communities in the name of conservation. Kitello was born and raised in the Mount Elgon forests of Kenya, where he and his communities have experienced violent evictions. Peter joined other community activists in advocating against land dispossessions and founded the Cheptikali Indigenous Peoples Development Project in 2000. He's been an active member of the organisation ever since, first as communication officer and now as their strategic director. Through this, Peter participated in suing the government of Kenya after it converted parts of his community's land to a game reserve, while at the same time trying to convince the government that a win-win outcome for conservation and land rights for the community was possible by allowing the community to live sustainably in its lands. He helped to write down his community's sustainability bylaws. Kitello convenes the Forest Indigenous Peoples Network and Community Land Action Now networks, which bring together traditional forest-dependent communities in Kenya to pursue issues of common interest, including implementation of Kenya's 2018 Community Land Act to formalise and protect customary lands. Kitello is also central to the IUCN-sponsored Whakatane processes that have been undertaken at Mount Elgon in Kenya and at the Kuhuzi-Biega National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. These processes seek to ensure that conservation is based on the recognition rather than the denial of community land rights. And Kitello has been working with the Batwa of Eastern DRC since 2014 to support them to regain their lands and to support conservation bodies to recognise that securing Batwa lands is the only secure route to forest protection. Kitello, if you are with us, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for convening this very enriching and a very, and it has a quite, I can see it has quite a lot of people with a lot of knowledge. And first of all, sorry, my network, I'm using my phone, so the network is not very good, so I won't be on video. And I would also be very brief because I think the first speakers have really gone into the details, and mine would be to bring experiences from the community's perspective, and really to go into the conservation and human rights. Because really that is where I come from. Our community lost, first of all, our community lost all our lands to conservation, to what is called the conservation areas. That is in the context of Kenya. Initially, during the colonial time, it was the forest reserves. So all the lands turned to forest reserves. And after independence, some that was left, a little that was left was turned into national park. And the last one, just recent as 2000, was turned into game reserve. And I think that is what was was trying to say that is what I've been involved in terms of trying to negotiate and also having gone to court on the same. Looking at the discussion, the wider discussion about conservation and human rights, I think for communities, really, it's been quite tough. And I can say, like, for our experience, for example, when I joined the other community members in the struggles in the 2000s, before I started interacting with other communities across the world and even in Kenya, because before it was just, I just knew the struggles for our community. I was not able to really see the big picture and how conservation has been used to dispossess communities. But when I started going and seeing other communities like the Sengwer in Kenya, like the Ogiek in Kenya, like the Awer in the coastal parts of Kenya, what has just been mentioned, the Batwas in Kausi-Biega, there's another community in Uganda called the Bennett. I realized that it's a wider struggle for indigenous peoples. Initially, we actually thought, and our communities, because we had not exposed ourselves to what is happening elsewhere, we thought it's just something that it's about our community. But when you look at it, and for me now, getting the experiences from all over the world, including what has been just shared in this forum, you can easily see that it's a global struggle, really, for indigenous people. And it's about conservation, the model of conservation, and human rights. And when you look at what is happening even today, you find that even the discussions around CBD, the discussions around, international human rights for us. And even in our country, like the Constitution, the Forest Conservation and Management Act, we have laws on historical land injustices. But when you look at actually accepting that we can move to a regime of human rights based kind of conservation, or look into communities participating in conservation, you find that we are still on the position that probably can best be described as hypocrisy state. We are not yet in that state whereby we accept that the old conservation has failed. And I say that because looking at laws and what I've just said, you find that there's still evictions, even as for our community as late as 2016. That's why we went to court, because of evictions. And yet in our country, our constitution recognizes communities like ours. It recognizes and says that there's need to address issues of historical land injustices. It talks about communities owning lands, ancestral lands, and lands traditionally occupied by communities are recognized as community lands. But when it comes to actual implementation of that, that is really where you see that we are still in a hypocrisy kind of discussion, that we have not accepted that a better way of doing conservation, whereby we have indigenous communities, local communities being brought at the center. Actually, their knowledge and all that being brought at the center of conservation is still not there. Governments, I've just had, like, maybe Canada, but you still find when you meet some of representatives from those countries that there's still problems. They talk of, for example, big investments coming to their lands. There is some movements, but I think generally across globally, and I think it's been mentioned, like the discussion I have been having with WWF, with the IUCN, which are major conservation organizations. You find really that we are still in the same state whereby we are just talking about the symptoms of how conservation has worked against the indigenous peoples, and how indigenous peoples' traditional ways of taking care of our lands is really not in the forefront of what we call conservation today, but it's seen as part of the problems that should be addressed with the current model of conservation. Yeah, maybe. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there, Tom. Thanks for really giving me this opportunity to give a highlight and summary. Yeah, thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Kitello. I'm so glad that we were able to connect with you and to hear these stories from your community and from your communities. The world needs to hear these stories and needs to hear how connected human rights are to conservation and how the two really must work together. And in fact, the world needs to hear all of the stories that we've heard today. And I think, as Miguel put it so well earlier, it's crucial that we all act together on this journey. That now concludes our speaking panel. So thank you very much to all of our speakers for now. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. I'll just go through as a reminder that you can use the Q&A box on your Zoom platform. If you're watching the live broadcast via the YouTube channel, then you can use the discussion panel there. If you can't access either of those things, you can also email your questions through to biodiversity@forestpeoples.org. If you can possibly include the name of the speaker, if your question is intended for one particular participant, then that would be very helpful. I'm going to start with a question here, and I'll maybe direct this to Joji, Sefa, or John, but others may like to join in. The question we had, the GBO5, the Global Biodiversity Outlooks, showed us that the world has failed to meet any of the biodiversity goals for the last decade. What will make the new global biodiversity goals that are currently being negotiated different? Nice, easy question there to
Thanks,
start.
Tom. Thanks, Tom. I don't know, I'm just adjusting my camera. Thanks, Tom. Some quick thoughts. We learn as we go. We learn by our mistakes as much as we learn from our successes. I think LBO tells us what's working on the ground. I think that it's time to embrace Indigenous peoples and local communities as partners in the on-the-ground implementation of the convention, and that's what I think needs to change. Also, don't be totally pessimistic about the current strategic plan that concludes this year. When you look up, particularly at the diagrams in the book, there are areas that we have some success in, including I think it's very likely we will reach the 17% target for protected areas that was set in the strategic. There is, but certainly it is true to say that we've failed to meet most aspects of most targets. But that means we need to redouble our efforts to make sure we don't make the same mistakes again. And Indigenous peoples and local communities are at the forefront of our efforts because they're the communities living close to nature. The people living close to nature need to be kept close to the Convention on Biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I think it's important to remember as well, it isn't all doom and gloom. And I think through the local biodiversity outlooks certainly shows where that action is taking place and is successful. Joji.
Yes, I was very encouraged by the meeting of SABSTA when it took place, because we clearly heard from the chair of SABSTA and the executive secretary, but also other parties, that understanding where the weaknesses were, for example, in terms of not really including the whole of society in the implementation of the convention, is one of the key areas that the parties have been saying they're really going to address. So Indigenous peoples and local communities, and putting that alongside GVO 5 means that there is a fuller consideration of what are the areas or weaknesses that have happened in the previous plan. So I'm actually confident that at least the openness to truly include program will be one of the areas that will really deliver good results for the 2050 strategy.
Thank you very much, Joji. I have another question that's come in. The impact of the pandemic has highlighted the importance of food systems, perhaps more now than ever before. What types of changes would you like to see in global food production systems? And are there any existing practices around agriculture in existence that might improve Hawaii's food systems? Debbie, obviously the second question is certainly directed at you, but would anybody else like to come in on that one as well? You may also.
So I can address the second question around agricultural practices. So yes, in Hawaii, ancient practice of wetland farming, lo'i. So a lo'i is an area that is sort of situated between the coastal area and the higher elevation areas. And local communities, again, in Hawaii are restoring lo'i today. And this is improving our food security systems based on local and traditional ecological knowledge and agricultural knowledge. So different places on every island, dryland lo'i and wetland lo'i are being restored and improving local communities' food systems. So there are even places that are engaging the community and then providing food to, for example, elders in the community on a weekly basis. So it's not just a pipe dream that's happening today.
Many thanks, Debbie. I'm not sure if any of our other panelists wanted to address any of the impacts of the pandemic and highlighting the importance of food systems. And we'll come back to that one later maybe as well. I have another question here. This was specifically asked of Miguel. How can we reward effective indigenous solutions and stop destructive financing? How can we influence finance, tax, trade policies, controlling development that impacts our ecosystems of ancestors and children? And how do indigenous peoples move beyond our position as property of corporations to governors of corporations impacting us? And others may come in there as well while we wait for Miguel to come with thoughts. Do we have Miguel? Maybe having connection issues. Okay, we'll leave that one for now. I think we may have had problems with connecting with Miguel. So I'll move to another question for now. Are speakers, and this is for all speakers, so please feel free to jump in. Are speakers aware of work that connects biodiversity, conservation, and travel and tourism? I'm not sure if any of our panelists have had experience with the travel and tourism industry, but Joji.
When we were in COP13 in Mexico, we were actually hosted by many indigenous communities who have made tourism community-based and where they become hosts of for visitors, right? So we visited a number of community organizations who were running restaurants, who were handling tour agencies, and who were generally managing their territories with a tourism component as part of their livelihoods. And that was so many visitors who were at COP 13, and in fact they have a big network called RITA of indigenous peoples and tourism, but tourism which is embedded in the strengthening of communities and the strengthening of biodiversity. So I think that really made that a big part of their own self-determined development.
Thanks, Joji. Debbie.
Yeah, no, so obviously travel and tourism is a huge part of Hawaii's economy, and we're inundated. It's actually been interesting during the pandemic because local people are able to access areas that they haven't been able to access as much because the tourism industry has declined so much right now, which is affecting our economy, of course. But there are local communities who are doing their part to try to work with the tourism industry and put some parameters on tourist behavior. So one community in particular has instituted a system where you park in a certain area and then you're shuttled into a state park and beach area. Whereas before people were trampling through a lo'i area, as I was speaking to earlier, that agricultural area, and parking all over the lo'i area. So a lot of it has to do with trying to help educate and control those types of behaviors and then work with government to try to institute policies that where there can be reasonable control over some of the tourism that occurs.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Another question here, which I will open to all panelists, but Josefa, this one may be a good one for you. What are your views on the current status of negotiations towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework?
Thank you for the question. Maybe I can give a brief comment in that there are a few elements that we, of course, the negotiations are still underway, but there are a few elements that have not yet been reflected as strongly as we would have liked in the draft of the framework. Some of these would be, for example, a much stronger reference or approach, or a much stronger human rights-based approach, which means reflecting human rights and pushing towards equity in the targets, goals, and indicators of the framework. We are also hoping that it can reflect more strongly intergenerational equity, which is justice between generations and ensuring that the rights of future generations to a safe, clean, and healthy environment are reflected very strongly, and ensuring that our actions do not cause harm in the long term. We're also hoping for a much stronger reference to education, as I elaborated more earlier. And we really think these elements would be essential to having an ambitious post-2020 framework that will really change things and not just be business as usual.
Thank you very much, Josefa. Would any of the other panelists like to come in on that one?
Certainly on the conservation goals and targets, I think the message coming from this panel, but also from indigenous peoples who have spoken previously, is that indigenous lands really need to be a distinct category, and that customary customary tenure should be recognized, customary tenure and governance, as shown that this is really a good way forward. So we're really hoping that this can be included in the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and that this is not an issue just for indigenous peoples. This is really a whole society issue if we are interested in nature's futures and in good relationships between people and nature.
Thank you very much, Joji. I have a few more questions coming in now as well, so please do keep them coming through either the Q&A box, or just a reminder, you can also email the questions through. If we don't have a chance to get to all of the questions today, then we can certainly come back to you afterwards. Just a reminder, that email address is biodiversity@forestpeoples.org. So some more questions for the panel. How can we better support frontline communities? I think that's come up quite a few times and come through quite strongly on the threats that people are facing. But how can we better support frontline communities?
Hi, Tom. Maybe I'll just make a very quick comment here from Canada. As a part of my work with the National First Nations advocacy body, one of the issues that we see is other groups, mainstream groups, NGOs, looking to support First Nations when it aligns with their cause, so to speak. or their interest. And really what support and the objective of supporting frontline communities is achieved not by strategically coming in when it is convenient, but rather by building relationships with communities and doing that as a common practice throughout all the time, not just when it's convenient or seemingly necessary. And it's in building those relationships that there is a learning that takes place and opportunities to work together and in the end to provide.
Thank you very much, Tonio.
Thank you.
Tom, maybe I could say something.
John, please.
Thanks, Tom. I think it's also, I want to pick up the issue of environmental defenders, which the CBD is taking more and more seriously, and it's working with UNEP and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The UN Environment Programme now has a environmental rights defenders policy to try and work out how we can best protect these people who are defending their lands and their environment. So that UNEP is currently looking at how to activate that policy and what are the actions that the UN Environmental Programme can take, and also when matters need to be referred to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, I recall the Executive Secretary 2 years ago spoke about, on average, 4 people were being killed a week. And this year, it's about 4 people a day. Most of those people are women. Most of those people are indigenous. So it's 4 people a day from 4 people a week in the last 24 months. So the crisis is growing. We need to take indigenous human rights environmental defenders very seriously. And we need to consider what their broader contribution is to the whole of society, the whole of humanity. Their traditional territories have been recognised by the IPBES Global Assessment as islands of biodiversity in a sea of degraded ecosystems. So it's obvious the areas that we need to pay attention to as we move forward. Thank you for that.
Thank you, John. Some sobering statistics there as well, I think, that really do reflect a lot of the stories we've heard today.
Can I weigh in on that one?
Please do, Debbie.
Okay. So I'm not indigenous. I'm not Hawaiian. So I helped to co-found an organization in Hawaii with local people. And we don't work where we're not invited. So the relational aspect of it that Tonio was referring to is really important. The work that we do, we were actually called into being by a master fisherman on the island of Molokai named Uncle Mac Poi Poi. And he said they needed a group that was going to help convene and bring together these traditional indigenous experts from across the Hawaiian Islands so that they could share lessons with each other, information with each other, strategies with each other, and asked us to play that sort of liaison, mediation, intermediary role, facilitative and technical assistance. So that's one way that as a non-indigenous person and a non-indigenous in a non-indigenous space, we can help provide support to local and indigenous communities who are engaged in this work.
Thank you very much. Kitello, would you like to come in on that question?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's a good question, and it's a question that we've been asking ourselves because this is the issue, for example, of conservation and human rights is a question that you would find that all over the place in many forums. It's presented as if it's being addressed. I think, and for example, in Kenya, And our experience with one community that was being evicted was that even people that you would expect, you know, human rights organizations, people with good intentions supporting indigenous people, for example, do not really understand what this question of human rights and conservation is. So I think, one, how should communities or indigenous people be supported? I think one is everybody that is supporting the cause of, you know, these human rights and conservation need to, first of all, learn, you know, understand it themselves. There is a misconception that we understand, and it's not the case. Like in Kenya, I was giving the example, we had human rights organizations who are saying, for example, the Sengwer community, actually, it's not that it's wrong to evict them, but they should be compensated. While the community were not interested with conservation. I'm just using that as an example, that we need to understand why indigenous peoples would say, you know, land tenure is at the core of conservation. It's not an understood concept, even within people that you would expect. So I think one is for all of us to understand and support that cause now once we understand it well through forums like, you know, taking awareness. And I think where we are now is making governments or conservation organizations really, you know, coming out and telling them, you know, what you're saying is not true. It's not genuine. It's just hypocrisy that you're saying. Because if it's genuine, then there should be action. I think for me, that is really what in this discussion would help indigenous people. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitello, and it's great to be able to see you as well. Okay, we are approaching the end of our session. We have 8 minutes left. We have a few more questions to go through. Just a reminder though, if we don't get to your question today, we will collect the ones that are in the chat. And if you'd like replies, please either email them to biodiversity@forestpeoples.org or leave your contact details in either the Q&A box or wherever you submit that question. I'd like to move to another question now. It's very important that representatives of indigenous peoples, youth, and women are included in the national delegations to participate in the negotiations of the Convention on Biological Diversity. How would it be possible to encourage this to happen, and how can we ensure those delegations are able to attend? John, there's maybe a question in there for you as well. We may not have John.
Sorry, just unmuting.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. It gives me a chance just to reflect on the current process for the, I'm going to stop saying post-2020 global biodiversity process because 2020 is almost over. At the moment, there is a zero draft on the table that's been updated. And this is just to explain the process in this implementation and the scientific body on technical and scientific advice, which has now been moved to the physical meetings have been moved, of course, into the first quarter of next year. But that's it. Zero draft is for those bodies to populate it with the kinds of things that we would like to see in the first draft, which will be the draft that's negotiated by the governments at the third open-ended working group on the post-2020 global biodiversity process, which is likely to be to look at the zero draft, to see what's missing, and to come prepared to populate it with what we need to have. So this zero draft is purely not for negotiation, but for these bodies with the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth, to participate in these bodies and provide the kind of details we need in the zero draft to make it the first draft, and that will be the draft that's negotiated. Sorry to bore people with process details. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I think these process details, although boring, are rather necessary, aren't they? So thanks for that. We are actually coming towards the end of our session, and there is a question that I would like to put to all the panelists before we finish. But just a reminder again of that email address is biodiversity@forestpeoples.org. If you would like your questions answered, please send them through to there and we will definitely answer them. And also, if you would like to talk with any of the speakers afterwards or be put in touch with other authors from the local Biodiversity Outlooks, please use that address to get in touch with us, either for interviews or to find out further information. So the last question, and I will take my liberty of chairing the meeting to do this, but I would like to ask each one of the speakers here. Next week, global leaders will be coming together at the UN Summit on Biodiversity. What would be the single most important message that you would like to hear them to hear from indigenous and local communities? What would be the single most important message you would like the UN Summit on Biodiversity leaders to hear from indigenous and local communities? I won't pick on anyone, but do volunteer.
I'll go first.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So if you go first, then you get yours in before somebody takes it. So I would say that indigenous peoples are the experts in conservation. They live close to the land and they have the strategies that can actually kind of redeem our world for conservation and sustainability. That'd be my message.
Thank you. Tonio, maybe next. Sorry, I'm just going in the order on my screen.
Yeah, for sure, Tom. I think we're all doing that with Zoom these days. You know, I guess the single message I'm thinking of is just the framing of recognizing indigenous people's rights is actually an enabler to addressing biodiversity issues. It's not a barrier. It's not something that gets in the way, and trying to communicate that. Thank you.
Crucial point, very well put. Josefa.
Maybe I just want to reiterate my key message earlier is that if we move away from this view that people and nature are separate and rather move towards the indigenous worldview that people are inseparable from the land and with the responsibility to care for the land, then the world would be in a much better state, I think. Thank you.
A very crucial point. Thanks, Josefa. Miguel, would you like to answer that question?
La relación espiritual que tenemos con la naturaleza es sumamente fuerte y están siendo destruidas. Entonces, queremos que los que estamos en primera línea defendiendo nuestros bosques, nuestros ríos, se tenga una mayor consideración, porque nuestras vidas corren riesgo, estamos en peligro. No queremos más muertes de defensores de derechos humanos por defender las tierras, los bosques. Creo que este mensaje es fundamental. Muchas gracias.
Many thanks, Miguel. John.
I see a very strong theme about our connection to nature. And in Aboriginal Australia, we say when Aboriginal people were asked, do you own this land? Our reply is, no, the land owns us. And I think that emphasizes Indigenous peoples local and traditional communities are close to nature. My message for a future, for a global biodiversity framework which will work, of course, it needs to be fully inclusive, but most importantly, they need to unleash the power of local action, the collective and local actions of indigenous peoples and local communities. And of course, I would paraphrase that requires breaking down some barriers, including a full recognition of their rights and attachment to place. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, John. Joji.
Yes, at the summit level, I think world leaders need to understand how interrelated climate, biodiversity, and human rights are. Therefore, really addressing indigenous people's rights will actually deliver many solutions, good benefits for the people themselves, biodiversity outcomes, and also the good biodiversity outcomes are actually addressing in a very serious way the biodiversity crisis underpinning climate change.
Thank you, Joji. And Kitello, would you like to comment on that question?
Sorry, Tom, my network, I couldn't get the question.
That's quite all right. Sorry, I will repeat that for you, definitely. At next week's UN Biodiversity Summit, what's the message that you would want to get across to global leaders on conserving the world's biodiversity and moving forward?
Yeah, I think for me, the question that should get to them is, for how long are they going to be for how long are they going not to be, for how long are they going to be hypocritical? I think that's the right word. For how long are they going to stop hypocrisy on the involvement of indigenous peoples and local communities in the conservation of biodiversity? So I think that question, they need to say, you know, is it business as usual, or we should end it, and maybe as we go on from here, post 2020, we are going to put what we say into practice. I think for me, that would be with that, the other things can roll in here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kitello. And that seems like a very good point to end. And thank you, everybody. This unfortunately concludes our briefing, as our time was up a few moments ago. I'm sure we would all like to say that we could quite happily sit and talk about this for many more hours and many more days. And this is, of course, the beginning of a lot of conversations. And we want these conversations now to continue, and we want the world to keep talking it from, as John said, we're no longer post-2020 negotiations. This is all about now negotiating for now and for all of our collective futures. I'd like to thank very much all of the speakers for joining us today. I'd like to thank everyone participating, including the panel, our experts, and I'd also like to put our thanks to the frontline defenders all around the world who are putting their safety and their lives at risk, and really who are the true guardians of the world's biodiversity. And I'd also like to say thank you. It's been my absolute privilege to chair such an incredible panel. If anyone would like to schedule any interviews with any of the panelists, or find out any more information or on the LBO report, there are some links in the chat box that my colleagues have been putting up to the local Biodiversity Outlooks report. And again, you can email us on that biodiversity@forestpeoples.org address. Thank you all, one and all, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to where you are. And I hope the rest of your days and weeks and months go very well. Take care and stay safe, everyone.
Thank you, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, evening, wherever you are. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John.